Every fantasy world has its wizards, but very few of them overthrew a living god and built an entire nation on stolen power. The Red Wizards of Thay did exactly that, then spent centuries murdering each other to control what they had taken. That country was ruled by 8 archmages, known as Zulkirs, each one controlling an entire branch of magic across the nation so completely that the Zulkir of necromancy commanded every necromancer, while the Zulkir of evocation commanded every battle mage. The structure of the state itself was built on permanent competition, since no ruler could grow stronger without weakening a rival who had every reason to destroy them first. If you have played Baldur's Gate 3, you may have found a book titled The Necromancy of Thay hidden in a cellar on the Sword Coast. That book exists because it was created inside this order, in a nation where magical specialization and rivalry and ruthless ambition shaped the entire society for centuries. Every wizard who entered the National Academy had to choose one school of magic as their life's work, permanently sacrificing 2 or more other schools that they would never be allowed to practice again. A necromancer who gave up evocation could raise the dead in ways no generalist could match, but could never cast a fireball for the rest of their life. That trade made every red wizard extraordinarily powerful within their chosen discipline, while leaving them fatally vulnerable outside it, since the school they had abandoned was the exact school that could be used against them without any defense. Advancement in Thay was never about becoming the strongest wizard in the room. It was about identifying which rival had sacrificed the discipline you still carried. That was the person you could destroy. The thing that made this sacrifice worth the cost was a cooperative casting method unique to Thay known as circle magic, where multiple wizards of the same school could channel their power into a single leader whose output then exceeded anything an individual caster could produce. That is how a nation of specialists projected force across an entire continent, not through individual genius, but through collective amplification that turned any group of red wizards into something far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. Circle magic could manipulate weather across entire regions to keep the Thayan plateau fertile despite its elevation, since they needed to feed the population that sustained it. At least 70% of the people who lived on the plateau existed in permanent servitude, with no legal path to freedom under any circumstance. The status passed from one generation to the next, without end, while the default punishment for any crime was to join them. Every field that was farmed, and every mine that was worked, and every tower that was built depended on people who could not refuse. Before any of that existed, the people who would become the Red Wizards were enslaved spellcasters who discovered a powerful demon imprisoned beneath a volcano. They used it to overthrow the divine rulers who controlled their empire, then seized the Eastern Plateau to build a nation of their own. That empire was Mulhorand, a theocracy on the far eastern edge of the same continent that holds the Sword Coast, where gods walked the earth in mortal form and ruled every province through divine incarnations that could not be challenged. Challenging a god king meant challenging the god itself, which left every wizard who could cast spells trapped inside a hierarchy where magic belonged to the temples that belonged to the gods, and where no path to power existed that did not pass through divine permission. Beneath the volcanic peaks of the Thaymount, a group of these wizards found something sealed inside the stone since before their civilization existed, a pocket of the abyss where a demon lord called Eltabbar had been waiting in a prison that was also a doorway. The rebels who would become the Red Wizards decided that enslaving a demon was an acceptable price for freedom from the gods they had been born under. They rallied every wizard willing to gamble their life on a rebellion that had a demon lord as its centerpiece. They marched south toward the holy city where 3 divine incarnations of the Mulhorandi pantheon were waiting to crush them at a place called Thazalhar. The combined force of the demon's host and the circle magic of 100 desperate wizards did what no mortal force had ever done before, which was destroy a god's presence on earth not once but 3 times in a single battle. Mulhorand retreated across the River of the Dawn as the rebels seized an elevated plateau ringed by mountain ranges with the volcanic Thaymount at its center. They imprisoned the demon beneath the same mountains he had been summoned from, since the wizards who used a demon to win their freedom were not foolish enough to let it keep its own. They built their capital Eltabbar directly on top of the prison, then designed the government that would eat itself alive for the next 5 centuries. Below the Zulkirs sat regional governors known as Thakions, who administered territory on behalf of the council without holding any magical authority of their own. Governance in Thay operated on 2 separate hierarchies that never aligned, one organized by magical discipline running horizontally across the entire nation, while the other, organized by geography, ran vertically through individual provinces. Every governor depended on whichever Zulkir controlled the wizards stationed in their region, while every Zulkir depended on whichever governor controlled the land their school needed to operate. That mutual dependency turned every administrative decision into a negotiation between people who could destroy each other but could not function alone. The wizards above them advanced by killing whoever failed to anticipate the method, because the council did not interfere with how its members competed so long as the competition never threatened the order itself. Poison delivered as a gift was acceptable, and a magical duel that collapsed a tower was tolerable, but any conflict that damaged the plateau's ability to project force outward was the one thing the ruling order would not forgive. For generations, this competition pointed inward. With every invasion the Zulkirs launched against their neighbors, collapsing before it began, because the council could never agree on who would govern the conquered territory. Then a faction realized that the same specialized production that made Thay terrifying to its enemies could also make it indispensable to them. Circle magic meant they could produce enchanted goods at a volume no single wizard or academy anywhere on the continent could match. The bound labor that sustained the plateau meant those goods could be priced below anything the local markets offered. The Guild of Foreign Trade operated from the port city of Bazantur. From there they negotiated with city governments across the Sea of Fallen Stars, the inland sea that connected most major ports on the continent, for permission to build walled compounds inside foreign cities. They called these compounds enclaves, and every host government that accepted was required to agree to 3 conditions before construction could begin. The first was sovereignty, which meant the compound was legally Thayan soil where Thayan law applied, while no local authority had jurisdiction inside its walls. The second was trade, which required the Red Wizards to price everything below whatever the local market charged, so that no independent enchanter could compete with an operation backed by an entire nation's forced labor. The third was that Thay alone would dictate which goods it sold in each city. The official function of every enclave was commerce, but every compound also operated as an intelligence post. Agents studied the host city's political fractures so thoroughly that the Zulkirs in Eltabbar eventually understood the internal workings of their trading partners better than those partners understood themselves. The price of buying enchanted goods below market rate was allowing a foreign power to learn everything about your city, while you learned nothing about theirs. The Lords of Waterdeep, the most powerful city on the Sword Coast, understood exactly what an enclave was, which is why they refused the conditions entirely. That forced the Red Wizards to gain access through a hidden portal connecting an embassy in the castle ward to a compound buried beneath the city in Skullport, a lawless underground port where the rules of the surface did not apply. The enclaves made Thay wealthy and connected and informed, but they did not fix the fundamental flaw of the Zulkir Council, because any faction could still act alone without the other's approval. 3 of them proved it when a regional governor joined forces with the Zulkir, who controlled conjuration magic, and an ambitious evocation specialist called Asnar Thrul, who was not yet a Zulkir himself. The 3 of them had identified an opportunity that the full council would never have approved. It was a deal with the commander of the salamanders, serpentine fire beings that served the rulers of a city known as the City of Brass on the elemental plane of fire. The terms were simple enough that no one involved stopped to consider why they were too simple. The salamanders would conquer the coastal cities along Thay's southern coastline on the Alambert Sea on Thay's behalf, while the Red Wizards maintained a permanent portal between the plane of fire and the material world. Neither side intended to honor the arrangement, because the wizards planned to banish the elementals once the coast was taken, while the Fire Lords planned to keep expanding once the portal was open. The entire agreement was built on two simultaneous betrayals that both parties assumed they would execute first. The critical mistake that both sides had failed to consider was that the deal had been made without the knowledge of a god called Kossuth, who ruled over all elemental fire. The agreement had no divine authority behind it, and no enforcement beyond the good faith of two parties who were already planning to betray each other before the fires had even started. The Red Wizards managed to banish the fire genies who ruled the city of Brass when the double cross came, but failed to banish the salamanders who turned on Thay itself. They scorched the Priador, the farming region south of the plateau, until the farmland that fed the southern provinces was ash. The coastal cities the deal was supposed to capture were surrounded by destruction that Thay had brought on itself. 3 wizards had started a war that the full council now had to finish. The Zulkir of Necromancy and the most dangerous wizard in Thay, Szass Tam, had been quietly building undead armies for decades. He was forced to pull his forces out of an offensive against Rashemen to fight salamanders that 3 of his colleagues had summoned without asking. That withdrawal cost him years of strategic positioning against the neighboring nation Thay had been trying to conquer for centuries, because the 8-school design meant that the consequences of one faction's ambition were always distributed across every other faction that had played no part in the decision. The war lasted over a year before Asnar Thrul made a desperate appeal directly to Kossuth himself, gambling that the god of fire would care more about reasserting authority over his own subordinates than about punishing the mortals who had started the mess. Kossuth had never sanctioned the deal in the first place, so the salamanders were operating outside divine authority in a way that threatened his own hierarchy. He sent his own elementals to drive the salamanders out, ending a war that 3 wizards had started by invoking a god that none of them had thought to consult at the beginning. The ruling structure had taught them that power was something you seized without asking permission from anyone above you. That lesson worked inside Thay, but collapsed the moment it was applied to a hierarchy that actually enforced obedience from the top down. The aftermath permanently changed the political landscape of the plateau. Kossuth worship exploded across Thay, while Asnar Thrul rode that religious authority all the way to the title of Zulkir of Evocation. That made him exactly the kind of rival that Szass Tam had been quietly positioning himself to outlast. Tam demonstrated what that rivalry would look like when a massive nomadic force called the Tuigan Horde swept out of the eastern steppes under a warlord called Yamun Kahan. The force was large enough to flatten Rashemen on its own trajectory without any help from Thay. Tam did not start the invasion, but simply recognized that something enormous was already moving in the direction he wanted it to go. He teleported the warlord to a meeting he had not requested and showed him a vision of his entire horde being destroyed by red wizard magic. Then he offered an alternative where the Tuigans would attack Rashemen from the east, while Thayan forces attacked from the south. He proved his commitment by parting the waters of the Lake of Tears so the horde could cross into Rashemen without delay. The gambit required no council vote and spent no political capital and risked none of Tam's own forces in the opening move, yet redirected an entire foreign invasion into the nation they had been trying to conquer for centuries. That is the kind of unilateral power that a competitive order cannot defend against, because the council was designed to reward exactly this behavior, but had not anticipated that one wizard would learn to apply it at continental scale. The war that finally broke the Zulkir Council began the way most institutional collapses begin, with one person inside the council deciding to use its own rules to consume it. Tam had learned from the Tuigan Gambit that unilateral action at sufficient scale could not be punished by a council that needed weeks to agree on anything, so he applied that lesson inward. He murdered his closest ally on the council, then arranged the evidence so that Asnar Thrul appeared responsible for the killing. That removed his most powerful supporter while simultaneously weakening his most dangerous rival. The council spent months investigating a crime whose only purpose was to make them investigate each other instead of watching Tam. He orchestrated an attack from Rashemen against Thayan territory, then arrived at the precise moment to rescue the defending forces. That made him appear to be the only Zulkir capable of protecting the nation from a threat he had manufactured. He built an undead force in secret that the council believed was an external danger gathering beyond the borders. Every fabricated crisis was designed to make the same argument without ever stating it directly, that Thay needed a single ruler with emergency powers and that the Zulkir Council had become too slow to protect the nation from the threats surrounding it. The council voted against his proposal because a rival Zulkir had discovered that every crisis Tam cited as justification for emergency powers had been manufactured by Tam himself. The debate was no longer about whether the council needed reform, but about whether one of its own members had been systematically dismantling it from within. That revelation split the Zulkirs into two factions with no possibility of reconciliation because neither side could afford to be wrong. The civil war that followed lasted a decade, with Tam holding the northern provinces from the Thaymount, while the remaining Zulkirs held the south from the capital Eltabbar. They fought across the same plateau that the ruling order had been designed to protect, because the design that divided authority by magical discipline had finally produced the outcome it guaranteed. The competition became so total that the competitors destroyed the thing they were competing over. They poisoned the farmland that fed the nation and flooded provinces that had been productive for centuries and engineered famine across territories whose populations had no ability to leave. The bound labor meant the people who suffered most from the war were the same people who had never been allowed to participate in the decisions that caused it. Both sides met at a fortress called the Keep of Sorrows, where the final battle was supposed to decide everything. In the middle of the fighting, the goddess of magic Maestra died, not because of anything that happened on that battlefield, but because of events unfolding across the entire world that neither faction had caused or could control. That catastrophe was the Spellplague, and it meant magic itself became chaos in the space of a single afternoon. Spells misfired on both sides, and the ground reshaped itself beneath the legions, forcing both factions to withdraw because neither could trust their own casting in a world where the rules of magic had just been rewritten without warning. Tam exploited the chaos the way he had exploited every other crisis, by making a pact with Bane, the god of tyranny, in which he offered his soul in exchange for the power to rule Thay for 1,000 years. The Spellplague had broken every other source of magical authority on the plateau, while divine authority still functioned. The war ended not because one side outfought the other, but because one wizard found a source of power that existed outside the order both sides had been competing within. He traded everything he was for a guarantee that no coalition of mortal wizards could challenge him again. What Tam built on the ruins of the old order was something that had never existed in Faerun before, an entire nation dedicated to undeath. The council was replaced with undead loyalists, while the living population descended in status below the corpses that now served as laborers across the plateau. Every red wizard who remained understood that advancement now meant eventually becoming undead yourself through lichdom or vampirism, since the alternative was to remain alive in a country that had decided the living were less useful than the dead. The Thayan plateau itself transformed after the Spellplague, stripped away the weather magic that had sustained its climate for centuries. The once fertile fields became ash-covered badlands, where the land reflected what its ruler had become. The nation no longer needed to feed a living workforce when the workforce no longer needed to eat. The agricultural infrastructure that had depended on bound labor for generations simply collapsed without replacement, since the dead do not require farms. The plateau became a wasteland governed from the Thaymount by a lich whose authority came not from the Zulkir council that had created him, but from a god whose only price was obedience forever. From the Thaymount, Tam constructed massive fortress artifacts called dread rings across the continent, designed to perform rituals of unmaking that could reshape reality itself. The ambition that had consumed the council from within had not ended with its collapse, but had simply transferred to a single ruler who now wanted what the Zulkir council had never been designed to deliver, which was power over the fabric of existence rather than power over other wizards. His own servant betrayed him first by trapping him inside a binding artifact called the Corsil's Siet, before attempting to seize the unmaking ritual for personal use. The exiled Zulkirs who had fled the civil war were forced to make a decision that revealed everything about what Thay had taught them. They returned not to finish Tam, but to free him, since a servant with a dread ring was more dangerous than the lich they already understood. They allied with the monster they had fled to stop the monster they had not expected, and helped him neutralize the traitor before turning on Tam themselves. The ruling order had trained every one of them to betray their allies the moment the shared threat was gone. Tam killed every single one of them. The council that produced all of this no longer exists in the form it was designed to take, but its products are still moving through the world long after the design that created them collapsed. Nations built on the export of magical goods leave artifacts behind the way empires leave roads, infrastructure that outlasts the authority that built it. A red wizard called Toth carried the Necromancy of Thay to the Sword Coast. Decades before the events of Baldur's Gate 3, a grimoire so saturated with the accumulated knowledge of undeath that the book itself resists destruction. It was not written to be read the way a scholar reads a text. It was built the way the Red Wizards built everything, as a tool that functions whether the person holding it understands what produced it or not. That is why it ended up in a cellar beneath the Blighted village on the Sword Coast, where anyone who found it could open it without understanding what was opening them in return. A book produced by a nation that spent centuries perfecting the relationship between the living and the dead does not stop working simply because that nation is gone. A wizard players can encounter in Baldur's Gate 3 is named Lorroakan, operating out of a magic shop called Sorcerous Sundries in the heart of Baldur's Gate, spent years trying to acquire exactly this kind of Thayan knowledge. He had no connection to the Red Wizards, but Thay had demonstrated something that independent wizards across the continent could not ignore, that organized magical production at national scale made individual practitioners obsolete. Every ambitious wizard on the Sword Coast was either trying to replicate what Thay had built or trying to acquire the artifacts it had left behind. A companion from the original Baldur's Gate games called Edwin, who had been expelled from the Red Wizards before the Civil War, still carried himself with the certainty that Thayan training had produced the finest wizards on the continent. That claim would have been arrogance from anyone else, but was difficult to argue against given what the Eight School Order had actually accomplished. The training that produced him had been designed to turn magical talent into institutional power so efficiently that even its failures still outperformed most nations' successes. Another companion from those same games, a Rashemen ranger called Minsc, had spent his life fighting the consequences of Thayan expansion without ever fully understanding the design that kept producing those consequences. Rashemen had been the target of Red Wizard aggression for so long that resistance to Thay had become part of Rashemen identity itself, which meant the Zulkir order had shaped even the nations that opposed it. The Thay Mount still stands at the center of a nation that has been conquered and reformed and overthrown and burned and resurrected and rebuilt without ever changing the fundamental principle it was founded on. The Red Wizards did not build a government. They built an argument that magical power concentrated through institutional discipline will always outperform magical power distributed among individuals. An argument that survived theocracy, survived the Zulkir Council, survived civil war, survived the Spellplague, survived lichdom, survived every attempt to destroy it from inside or outside. The argument does not require any particular ruler to remain true. It only requires that magic remains scarce enough to reward the people who organize its production. Somewhere on the Sword Coast tonight, a wizard is reading a book that came from a cellar, that came from a nation that came from a rebellion that started when a group of enslaved spellcasters looked at the gods who ruled them and looked at the power those gods were hoarding and decided that if divinity could be organized, then so could they.